Welcome to Inside Out live stream on LinkedIn. This is our first live stream on LinkedIn. I'm very excited. I'm also excited because of our guest, Dr. Marc Hurwitz, co-author of the bestseller Leadership is Half the Story, and also follow I'm a professional speaker. I'll get this right. Followership Education. He is the co-founder of Flip University, and you'll see the link to that under his name in a minute. But the real reason I invited Marc onto this show is that because he's a real live neuroscientist. Now, I refer to neuroscience in my keynotes and workshops. I pretend to know what I'm talking about. But Marc, he has a PhD in cognitive neuroscience and a master's degree in math, physics, and business. Plus, I'm looking at my notes for this because it's a list here. He teaches leadership, organizational behavior, entrepreneurship, and consulting at the University of Waterloo, my alma mater. I got a degree in chemistry there. We are going to talk about how all those pieces, well, most of those pieces, fit together in the context of storytelling. So stick around. This is going to be good. Welcome, Dr. Marc Hurwitz.
Thank you, Michelle. Hey, great intro. And I didn't know you're a chemist from UW.
It's a Bachelor of Science degree with a major in chemistry from University of Waterloo. That's right, that's me. And then
Wow.
and the reason this is about you, but maybe later you can ask me the story for how I got into storytelling because there's a chemistry link there.
Cool. Well, I'm looking forward to hearing that, but I guess that's not for today. So,
Not for today. So, Marc, I'm really excited. In the lead up to this, we were talking about this. Now, it really doesn't mention storytelling in your bio, but I know that you're interested in it. Why don't we just start there? You heard me talk about the laundry list of credentials that you have: business, math, physics, neuroscience, all of that, and leadership. Just tell me where does storytelling fit? Let's just dive right into it.
sure. You know, one of the things that all of those disparate pieces of my background, maybe not so much the science, have in common is that you need to be able to persuade people, and not just persuade them. Um, that you are right, but persuade them to do something. So if you're an entrepreneur, you may need to persuade somebody to give you money. If you're in a leadership role, may need to persuade people to follow you or go in this direction that you're trying to send them in. Um, in organizations in general, you want to align people and get your message out and talk to customers and do all these great things. And storytelling is integral to all of those. But there's also a part of me, like, I'm always on a quest to learn the why behind things because sometimes that informs what you do. And that's partly the reason I ended up in neuroscience, because when I'm interested in people and I want to know why do they do what they do? What I learned, now it's interesting, if anyone out there goes and gets a degree in cognitive neuroscience, you will learn all the brain parts and you will learn weird and wondrous things because the brain is stranger than you would ever possibly imagine. It really is. Like
The brain is yeah. We are strange.
well, it is. There are so many weird things out there. I can't even begin to tell you. But what I did notice in my studies was that in terms of making them practical, it's more the principles that matter. And neuroscientists don't actually talk a lot about principles. But when you understand the principles of how the brain works, it informs your practice in so many different ways, including how to be more persuasive, why you should tell a good story, what are the elements, what are some of the elements of a story that are most important in terms of delivering your message, and perhaps too why some people are even resistant to your story. And for me,
Hmm.
that's kind of cool.
So that's a great segue because everything you've mentioned is, well, I want to learn more about that. Oh, and then you say something else, is I want to learn more about that. Let's talk about maybe give me an example of when you really saw, uh, and then if you can deconstruct it for us a little bit, just give us an example of when a story was central to maybe a leader helping people come along with him on his vision or mission, or an entrepreneur raising
Yeah,
money, venture capital, something that I do a lot of
yeah.
with my clients. But yeah, give me an example.
Sure. So one of the I work with a lot of young entrepreneurs. University of Waterloo is actually famous worldwide for that. I was in Silicon Valley before the pandemic, and at one of the biggest incubators down there. And the minute I told them I was from University of Waterloo, their eyes lit up. Everybody knew who I was or where I came from. It was pretty cool. So I work with a lot of young entrepreneurs, and many of them are passionate about what they do, passionate about why they do it, and talk a lot about their product. This is what my product can do. So let me give you an example. I have a young entrepreneur who's now been doing this for a while, started a company called Landmine Boys. They've renamed their business to Demine Robotics.
Hmm.
And this young man was from, I believe, Cambodia, and he knew many people who there are still many mines in Cambodia, and it's very difficult to get rid of them because it's dangerous work. And so what he wanted to do was create essentially a robot which would go and either dig up the mine or just explode it. He preferred to dig them up because if you explode them, it leaves a lot of shrapnel in the ground, and the ground becomes not farmable for many generations to come. And so he was, trying to work on this. And so he would go to his pitches, and he would start his pitches off by talking about this wonderful robot that he was building, which takes landmines out of the ground without exploding them. And he would tell about how many people every year die from a landmine, and what the statistics are, and how many landmines are still left in places like Asia, where there have been these historic wars, et cetera, et cetera. And the facts were overwhelming and compelling, but they didn't actually get people to give him money. And you'd think, why not? Well, we worked on his pitch, and he's been working on it, frankly, ever since. Every time I hear him, he still changes it. And he realizes that what he has to do is start off by telling a story. And not just the story of his business, but the story of a human being who's actually been personally affected by having someone in their family, or by having themselves being hurt and crippled by a landmine. So that rather than talk about his product at the beginning, he starts with a story. He then follows it up with statistics and all the kind of things you'll need to reinforce your desire to invest. And it's been a success. I mean, he's been funded, and he relentlessly now practices telling stories, and has gotten better at it over time. Still, still he could use you, Michelle. Um,
Well,
but
you know where to find me, Mark.
I know what.
You know where to find. But interestingly enough, I earlier this year, I worked with a early stage startup.
Yeah,
Again, just exact same scenario as what you just described. Great product, great idea, and I said, well, it's what I call the origin story. Tell me how this came about. And I believe everybody needs to have their origin story. It's almost like it's where does your superpower come from, like, right? So how does Spider-Man get his superpowers? That's your origin story. And he resisted. He said, "Nah, I got it from my previous job. People don't want to hear about that. It's because I was personally affected by this problem." And I said, "You got to." And finally, maybe I just wore on him a little bit enough, and
yes.
he ended up posting it. We did a video of him posted on the website, and he got to his second round of funding. So exactly
Hmm.
the same story. This stuff really works. It really
Amazing.
works. Now,
Yeah.
tell me, you really
Why it
piqued my
works?
curiosity. Well, no, let's start about why it didn't work without it. What was not just don't tell me what was missing in terms of the story, but from a neuroscience point of view, why didn't it work?
Right. So here's the way the brain works. We learn, I mean, there are different ways that we learn, but one of the primary ways that we learn is something called Bayesian learning. You probably never heard that term before, but here's what it means. We develop schemas about the way we think the world works. And the way that happens is that we get a new piece of data from the world. It comes into our brain, and our brain kind of goes, okay, maybe the world works like this, but I'm not sure yet because it's just one piece of data. We get another piece of data in, and now our brain's going, okay, says the same thing. Yeah, I'm beginning to buy this. And it gets a third and a fourth and a fifth. And we learn all sorts of things this way. In fact, it's the primary way we learn when we're young. So, for example, when kids are really little, they don't understand the idea of object permanence. In other words, that when an object disappears behind another object, it hasn't disappeared for real. It's still there and it will come back, right? So that's how come peekaboo is so exciting for really little kids, because the minute your face is gone, it's like, oh, the person is gone. And then, oh, they're back. Ah, ha, ha, that's very funny. Um, but you notice that when you do that with a 6 or 7 year old, they're not so keen on the game anymore because they've learned. And by the way, humans are one of the few animals that actually can learn object permanence. But they learn through this Bayesian inference of this idea of object permanence. Now, magicians exploit that, right? Because you'll see something disappear behind something else, and then it'll be gone. And that's another shock to the system. Does it make you change your mind about object permanence because it's disappeared? You think, no, it's just a magic trick, right? But what if this happened over and over and over again in many different situations in life? Over time, you would eventually begin to doubt the idea of object permanence. Why is that? Well, you've built up this huge backlog of data that tells you something is the way it is. And so when you get one instance of new piece of data, here's what we hope happens. We hope if I suddenly tell Michelle one thing that's new and interesting, it'll immediately go into his mind and change his vision of the way the world works. All his schema will change. What really happens is this: a new idea goes into Michelle's mind, possibly into short term memory, and you can even be convinced at the time that what Mark said made a lot of sense. Hey, smart guy, maybe, I can believe this. But then, as your brain starts to sift through what I said compared to everything it already knows, oftentimes this happens overnight, it can reject it or suppress it as the most relevant piece of data in favor of all the stuff that it already knows. So if you've ever had this experience, and I can't imagine anyone out there hasn't had this experience, you walk in to a client's office and you're going to persuade them of all sorts of things because you've got the facts down. Maybe you're an engineer, maybe they're an engineer. And if you just give them the facts, they'll change their mind about something. So you sit and you talk with them a while, and at first they're reluctant, and then eventually they go, oh, yeah, okay, Mark, yeah, I get your point. You know what? I'm going to do what you say we should do. And then the next day or the next week, you come back to them and say, so have you implemented anything? And they go, no, I thought about it some more, and it actually didn't really make sense to me. And you're like, what? Like, I no. Well, what's actually happened is that their brain has subconsciously evaluated this one piece of new datum that you've given them compared to the schema that already exists in the mind and just said, no, I'm rejecting it. So, what's that got to do with storytelling? Here's the thing: what you need to do is make that piece of datum more salient to the brain so it has a chance to compete against what somebody already knows. And how do you do that? Well, it turns out that the brain pays attention to things that have emotions attached to it. And so if you can tell them a good story that has an emotional content with it, it has a chance to overcome the Bayesian schemas that are already been learned by that person's brain. I'll give you an extreme example of it. PTSDs can be caused by one single event as long as it's attached to extremely strong emotions. And because of a PTSD, it can nearly permanently, without some cognitive behavioral therapy or something like that, change somebody's behavior and reaction, because it's that strong emotional content which is managing to overwhelm what the person already knows is rationally true. I have a fear of heights, and I know it's not rational, but I'm not able to overcome the emotional content with the rational content and not be afraid of heights. There are ways of overcoming it. And the point is not to tell you all the things I'm scared of, because it's probably not the only thing. But the point is that a good story with an emotional hook to it uh, is, from a neuroscience perspective, one of the few ways to overcome the Bayesian learning effect in the mind. The other thing is repetition. Every advertising person knows this. But what repetition is doing is it's adding enough new data over and over and over again so that ultimately the brain can evaluate this new thing with this old thing and make a choice to do something different. So that even if the person knows that what you say, and all of us have bad habits, you know, uh, smoked meats are a type 1 carcinogen, according to the World Health Organization. That's not stopping a lot of people from eating smoked meats, because the data itself is not enough for people to make a decision. They need the emotional content. And humans are primed, we're designed to get that emotion from stories.
So it's almost like this story, as long as it has an emotional element to it. I mean,
Yes.
story should have an emotional element to it, anyways. So the stronger the emotional impact, it's almost like it's on a scale. It weights it against the Bayesian experience if it's different, and the more emotion, the more chance you have of overcoming this part. You made me laugh, by the way, when you talked about the peekaboo, and you said very funny, ha ha ha. I thought it was there, and then you reminded me of, oh, what he's talking about is the prediction error. Is that a neuroscience principle?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
In fact, people talk about dopamine as that kind of happy drug in the brain, but really what it is it's the paying attention drug in the brain, and helps alert you to what's important and that you make predictions about. So that's really, thank you. That's a really nice insight, which I haven't put together myself. And that, yeah, this is all part of the brain's prediction mechanism. And how does it do it? Well, it does it by saying, given this weight of evidence here, this is what I think's going to happen. And then when it doesn't, well, okay, maybe you just pulled the magic trick on me, or maybe you told me something that was interesting but not important enough to do something about.
But what's interesting to me is that it's all we get a hit of dopamine when
Yeah.
we are wrong. So it's
Yes.
almost like our evolution is rewarding us for learning something new by being
Mm.
wrong. And
Yeah.
but it's not universal. It can't work all the time, because there's that other part of us that never likes to be wrong. So
Well, I mean, the mechanism that works really works well. It's designed for an ecological environment which is really different than the world we live in, right? Like back when our brains were developing all these fabulous mechanisms, and when in fact we inherited them from our forebears, we weren't also being asked to evaluate complex sets of data coming in over the internet, or books that we're reading, or whatever it happens to be, or logical arguments, Aristotelian logic and all that kind of stuff. Like we think that humans are fundamentally rational, and what I struggle with is when we say that people are irrational. No, they're not irrational. They're designed for a different environment than the one we're putting them in. So it's irrational to expect them in that environment to do the rational thing. Uh, and I struggle to explain this to my engineering students and my computer science students and all that because they think, if I just tell people the fact, they'll do what I think they'll do. And they don't even have the self awareness to realize if I tell you the facts, engineer, you still, in many cases, aren't going to do what you need to do. Um, but they learn. I mean, the ones who tell the stories learn. So it's critical. And I should add one more thing in there, which is just kind of a fun fact. People will like this. So there's a study that's been done by some neuroscientists to look at the impact of adding a few neuroscience terms into a story that you're telling.
Okay.
Yeah. So, if you start talking about the prediction errors in the brain or the basal ganglia or, you know, um, I don't know, the insular cortex, no one talks about that, but the amygdala, whatever it happens to be. The minute you throw in some of those neuroscience-y words, even if a real neuroscientist would go, that doesn't make any sense.
Or
Those
you,
of us,
or you, he's using it in the wrong context.
yeah,
He really
yeah,
doesn't
yeah,
understand what it means. That would
exactly.
describe me, right?
Well, I know you're a well-read guy, so I wouldn't say that. But it actually turns out it makes your argument more persuasive.
Uh-huh.
So,
So
so
that's
toss a few little neuroscience.
two ways that neuroscience helps storytelling.
Yes.
Just toss a few terms in. So I'm writing this down. Basal ganglia
Yeah.
sounds disgusting.
Totally. Yeah.
And
The,
prediction error. I teach prediction error in my comedy workshop
oh, that makes a lot of sense.
because, well, first of all, we people for years and years and years, people said we don't know why people laugh. Well, we do. We actually do know why people laugh, and if we
Yeah.
understand that, we can leverage it more intentionally. Anyways,
That's
that's another workshop.
okay. Another time.
Talk to me about leadership. I think there are a lot of people who are watching this who are business leaders.
Yeah.
And yes, we understand that no matter what we are, no matter what we do, we're always selling. We're either selling a vision or we're pitching for money or we're making a sale. We're always selling. But
Yeah.
leadership has this other dimension to it. And I know that this is a big part of the kind of work that you do. Um, Talk to me a little bit about the neuroscience in leadership and if their storytelling fits into that.
Oh, I mean, here's a really interesting experiment that you can do. So storytelling completely fits into it. Leadership, you got to start with a definition in a sense of what leadership is. It's not a position that we have or that someone's given us, uh, because we can try and lead all we want, and if no one wants to follow, we're not going to go very far with them. In fact, leadership is about creating a framework for action. And if you always think about how do I create this framework that other people want to work within, that's how to be the most successful leader. So, what you have to do is think about what is it that other people want and what's going to be the right frame. I don't want a frame that's too narrow because that's too constricting. I don't want a frame that's too big because it's too general. And I know that, for example, if you ask people to be creative and you give them no framework around it, it's actually very difficult to be truly creative. Creativity actually comes from that kind of tension between what you can do and what you can't do, and trying to find ways around it is how you get the creative juices literally
Of
flowing.
course, I know that from my advertising agency days. You know, the most
Yeah.
important element in creativity is the brief
Yeah.
because
And
you're not thinking about everything.
yes, exactly. Yeah, you've got to narrow it down. There's some other interesting things, by the way. It turns out you've probably heard that you shouldn't converge and diverge at the same time. Uh, and the
Well,
reason for that,
for the people who are watching this, could you explain what you mean? I know what you mean, but converge and diverge in brainstorming, presumably.
right? So when you're trying to come up with ideas in a brainstorming session, diverging is coming up with lots of ideas. Converging is analyzing each idea and deciding if it's a good one or a bad one. And if you do them both, it's well known in the creativity community that you shouldn't do both at once. What's less well known are the reasons why, and the reasons why have a lot to do with neuroscience, and also give you some tips on how to be better at it. So, for example, there is an area in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, just part of, we'll just say
You,
part of the,
Mark, you just threw that in to be more credible, didn't you?
I,
You just threw that in. Prefrontal cortex. I'm writing that down.
and the angular gyrus. So put that in
Oh,
because that's the story. The angular gyrus. It's real.
okay.
It's
All
not about
right.
here, you know. Maybe it's a little bit higher. It's about there. And it turns out that when you are trying to come up with ideas, that part of the brain is activated. When you are trying to critically analyze ideas, that part of the brain is slightly deactivated. And you can imagine then you can't activate and deactivate at the same time. And what it does is literally impair your ability either to come up with ideas, but also to critically analyze them. Turns out we're also better at being creative when we're slightly happy. And we're better at being critical when we're slightly unhappy. There's a
Uh-huh.
famous story of Alfred Hitchcock when he was coming up in his movies of, came up with some kind of technical issue in a movie. He would take the crew aside and he would start telling jokes because he needed them to be creative.
Right. Oh,
And again,
that's interesting. You know, you may have just answered my next question. We're going to wrap this up in a few minutes, and then we're going to be going backstage for members of Inside Out Storytelling. But before I do, you know what? Like I said, this is the first time I'm doing LinkedIn Live. So if anybody has comments, please tell us that our audio, I know it's kind of late in the game, but tell us our audio is good, we sound good, and we look good, and you like our haircuts or something. Um,
you look good, Michelle.
Good, thank you. I have a
And I like
question,
the haircut.
uh, and I like yours. Listen, Mark, how how can somebody watching and listening to us, what could they do to implement a principle of neuroscience in their lives, like right away?
Sure. Um, okay, so a very simple thing is to separate uh, data from either decision making or from brainstorming by at least 5 minutes and preferably longer.
Hmm.
It turns out that the subconscious, there's some wonderful research by a researcher, I believe he's Dutch, Ap Dijksterhuis, on what are the best ways to take in a lot of our brains are really limited in what they can do, and they are at least consciously, but subconsciously they're massively powerful computing machines, if you will, although they're not actual computers. And you need to be able to give people time to make that work. So if you have a session where you give people a whole bunch of data and then immediately expect them to think about it and make a decision, they're going to make a worse decision than if you give them the whole bunch of data and then you take even a 15-minute break and just make some small talk and then come back and say, okay, now let's make a decision. That's a
You
real
know,
neuro.
I think I just got my money's worth out of this session because because you know, I do workshops all the time. And what you've just given us is a principle that I could apply in my workshop design.
Yes.
Does it apply, like, would it apply, like, does a break work as well as small talk?
Yeah, anything which distracts people from thinking about the idea for at least 5 minutes. My preference is longer. Overnight is better because it gives time the brain more time to consolidate the information.
Mm-hmm.
But even a 5 minute break where you consciously get people thinking of something different. So they're not going away on break and chatting with everybody else about what they just heard. You
Right,
want them
got
to
it.
actually engage the brain to do something else for at least 5 minutes.
That's amazing. Thank you. Um, how can people find out more about you?
Well,
There's there's
yeah.
so half an hour. Like I don't, we barely scratched the surface. The surface? How can they sign up to your courses and do all that stuff?
Well, thank you for asking. If they go to flip.university, they'll find information there. We actually have the Neuroscience of Work, which is called Work Smarter, Not Harder. That we actually go through, I go through 12 principles of neuroscience like the ones I've told you. And there's even some super cool other ones in there. I wish we had more time to talk about. But you can go through the whole thing. It takes you about 3 or 4 hours, and it will change the way you work. It will change the way you work, and it'll make the way you work better. Like, there's more to understand about the importance of emotions and decision making, for example. We haven't even scratched the surface of that. And it is so important. You can't make decisions without emotions. And I'll leave that as a little teaser.
And we're back to storytelling. You,
And we're
you,
back to storytelling.
because you gotta put your emotion into your story. Listen, Marc, I want to thank you for doing this with us. This has been great. Even if all people just take away with them is just 1 or 2 points from this, I know it'll make an impact. I've told you, it's been great. But we'll talk some more, and I'm gonna see you backstage in a minute. See
Okay.
you there. All right, well, that's it. You just heard Dr. Marc Hurwitz talk about storytelling, neuroscience, leadership, business. I don't think a little bit about math and a little bit about physics, but how it all comes together and how you can use these principles in your life and business. I want to thank you for watching and listening. This has been, like I said, the first time we've done this on LinkedIn Live. I think I'm happy with the results. Please leave comments. And if you want to find out anything more about what I do, go to insideoutstorytelling.com. And once again, see you next. I don't know if it's going to be next month or the month after, but we'll see you soon. Thanks again. Have a great rest of the day.